What happens when a billionaire who built his empire on lies finally faces the full weight of justice? Malcolm Royce, once a symbol of wealth and power, now stands accused of defrauding countless families, destroying their futures to fuel his greed. But this is no simple trial. Hidden accounts, dangerous allies, and a brother's shocking betrayal threaten to unravel everything Malcolm has worked to protect. As the fight for justice unfolds, unexpected twists and high-stakes confrontations lead to a dangerous game of cat and mouse. From daring infiltrations to life-altering revelations, every move could tip the balance between justice and revenge. Will Malcolm's victims finally get the justice they deserve, or will his network of corruption prove too powerful to bring down? Before we dive into this thrilling tale, take a moment to subscribe to our channel for more gripping stories like this. And let us know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? The courthouse was alive with whispers and camera flashes as Malcolm Royce emerged from his sleek black car. Dressed in a tailored navy suit, his every move exuded confidence. For weeks, his name dominated headlines: fraud, deception, and the collapse of countless lives. But today, the spotlight was on the trial that could shatter his gilded world. Inside, the gallery was packed. Victims, journalists, and onlookers filled the benches. Among them sat Sarah Vaughn, a widow who lost her life savings, and Greg Foster, a retired teacher forced to sell his home. Their faces were etched with anguish and determination. Malcolm entered the courtroom as if it were his boardroom. His sharp gaze scanned the room before settling on the judge's bench. Judge Diana Moore, known for her unflinching pursuit of justice, took her seat. Her calm, commanding presence silenced the room. "All rise," the bailiff announced. The crowd stood, but Malcolm remained seated, casually flipping through notes. His lawyer, Jonathan Price, leaned in to whisper urgently. Malcolm dismissed him with a wave, his smirk daring anyone to confront him. Judge Moore's piercing eyes locked onto Malcolm. "You may be seated," she said, her tone controlled but firm. The opening arguments began. Prosecutor Rachel Dyer wasted no time. "Ladies and gentlemen," she addressed the jury, "Malcolm Royce promised security and prosperity, yet left devastation in his wake. He preyed on trust, exploiting hard-working families for his gain. Today, we begin the process of justice." Malcolm yawned, his indifference igniting murmurs in the gallery. The prosecution called its first witnesses victims who recounted heartbreaking losses. Greg Foster testified, 35 years I taught children, saved every penny. And in a blink it was gone." His voice cracked as he recalled losing his home. Sarah Vaughn followed. "I trusted him. He smiled and said it would be safe. But my kids slept in our car for a month." Her words hung in the air, heavy and raw. Despite the gut-wrenching stories, Malcolm remained unshaken. Occasionally, he leaned back to check his phone, his smug grin never wavering. When court adjourned, whispers rippled through the room. Yet Malcolm strode out with his head high, his confidence unbroken. But as the day ended, whispers gave way to rumors. Was Malcolm's confidence misplaced? A shadowy figure observed the trial from the back row, a man no one seemed to know. In the quiet hum of the courthouse parking lot, Sarah and Greg shared a brief moment. "He'll get what he deserves," Greg said firmly. Sarah nodded, though her eyes betrayed doubt. "If the system works," she whispered. As Malcolm Royce stepped into his car, he didn't notice the shadowy figure lingering nearby, watching every move. The courtroom may have seemed predictable, but hidden hands were at play. Little did anyone know, The trial was only the surface of a far deeper web. As the courtroom doors reopened the following morning, the air buzzed with anticipation. Prosecutor Rachel Dyer had promised a pivotal witness, someone with evidence that could dismantle Malcolm Royce's carefully constructed facade. But even she seemed uneasy, as though the revelation carried a weight she hadn't fully anticipated. Malcolm Royce entered the courtroom, his confidence unshaken. He barely glanced at the murmuring crowd, more focused on his polished reflection in the phone he used to check stock updates and ignore the world. His lawyer, Jonathan Price, whispered to him again, his tone urgent. "Relax," Malcolm muttered, his voice dripping with condescension. "This circus ends with my victory." Judge Moore entered, her gaze steady and unreadable as always. "Court is now in session. Prosecutor Dyer, you may call your next witness." Rachel stood, clearing her throat. "Your Honor, the prosecution calls Daniel Royce to the stand." The room fell silent. Malcolm's smirk vanished. He stiffened in his chair, his jaw tightening as a man in his late 30s stepped into the courtroom. Dressed in a modest suit, Daniel Royce carried none of Malcolm's swagger. His shoulders were slightly hunched, his expression somber. Gasps rippled through the gallery. "Malcolm's younger brother?" Whispers erupted, spreading like wildfire. As Daniel was sworn in, Malcolm leaned toward Jonathan, his voice a harsh whisper. "What is this?" Jonathan shook his head, equally caught off guard. "I don't know. He wasn't on any list." Rachel approached the witness stand. "Mr. Royce," she began, her tone measured, "can you tell the court about your relationship with the defendant?" Daniel took a shaky breath. "Malcolm is my brother." Rachel nodded. "And how would you describe that relationship?" Daniel hesitated, glancing at Malcolm, whose glare could have melted steel. Distant, he finally said, "We haven't spoken in years." Rachel stepped closer. "Why is that, Mr. Royce?" Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he gripped the edge of the stand. "Because I found out what he was doing, and when I tried to stop him, he used me." The gallery erupted in murmurs again. Judge Moore's gavel slammed down. "Order in the court." Malcolm's composure cracked. "This is absurd," he barked, rising from his seat. "Mr. Royce," Judge Moore warned, her voice icy. "Sit down." Rachel continued. "Daniel, you've mentioned your brother used you. Can you clarify?" Daniel nodded, swallowing hard. "He made me sign documents I didn't understand. He told me they were routine papers for his company, but they were fake transactions. When the truth came out, I was nearly arrested. He cut all ties and left me to deal with the fallout." Malcolm clenched his fists. "You were always a coward, Daniel," he muttered under his breath. Rachel produced a folder and handed it to the judge. "Your Honor, these documents corroborate Daniel's testimony. They contain signatures traced to accounts linked directly to the fraudulent schemes." Malcolm shot up again. "This is a setup. He's lying." "Enough, Mr. Royce," Judge Moore said sharply, her patience wearing thin. The gallery buzzed with the revelation. Malcolm Royce, the untouchable tycoon, had used his own brother as a pawn in his schemes. Daniel's testimony painted a picture not just of greed, but of betrayal. When the session adjourned for the day, Malcolm stormed out of the courtroom, his lawyers struggling to keep pace. In the shadows near the exit, the mysterious figure from the parking lot watched Malcolm leave, their eyes glinting with quiet intent. The cracks in Malcolm's armor were widening. But who was pulling the strings behind the scenes? Malcolm Royce was pacing furiously in the private meeting room of the courthouse, his polished demeanor unraveling. His lawyer, Jonathan Price, sat across the table, scanning the newly introduced documents. "This is a disaster," Malcolm hissed, his voice low but venomous. "How did Daniel even get those records?" Jonathan sighed, his forehead creased with worry. "It doesn't matter how he got them. What matters is that they're admissible." The judge accepted them without hesitation. Malcolm slammed his fist on the table. "I told you to make sure there were no loose ends." Jonathan raised a hand to calm him. "The documents alone aren't enough to convict you. But if the prosecution finds more, we're in trouble." Meanwhile, in the courtroom, Rachel Dyer sat at her table, her laptop open. She scrolled through an extensive list of transactions, each tied to Malcolm's various shell companies. Something was missing. There was a gap in the records she couldn't ignore. "Where's the rest of it?" she muttered to herself. Her assistant, Claire, leaned over. "You think there's more?" Rachel nodded. "I'd bet my career on it. A man like Royce doesn't let everything sit in plain sight. He's hiding the real money somewhere." The trial resumed, and Rachel called forensic accountant James Hill to the stand. A soft-spoken man in his 40s, James carried himself with quiet confidence as he was sworn in. "Mr. Hill," Rachel began, "you've been analyzing the financial records tied to Malcolm Royce's companies. What have you discovered?" James adjusted his glasses. "At first glance, the records suggest a complex network of investments and transactions. But after closer inspection, I found inconsistencies, missing funds that couldn't be accounted for within the listed accounts." Rachel nodded. "How much are we talking about?" James's voice was steady. "Approximately $200 million. The gallery gasped. Malcolm's face darkened, his jaw tightening. Rachel pressed on. "Did you find any evidence of where these missing funds might be?" James hesitated. "Not definitively, but there are traces of transfers to an offshore account. The account is listed under a name not immediately tied to Mr. Royce, but the patterns match his financial behavior." Rachel approached the jury, holding a printout of a suspicious transaction. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit this evidence of a $10 million transfer to an offshore account registered in the Cayman Islands." Jonathan jumped to his feet. "Objection. Speculative at best." Judge Moore raised an eyebrow. "Overruled. The jury will consider this evidence." Malcolm leaned toward Jonathan, his voice a whisper dripping with panic. "This can't be happening. That account was buried. No one was supposed to find it." Jonathan's response was terse. "Apparently someone did." As the court adjourned, Rachel returned to her office, a flicker of frustration in her eyes. The offshore account wasn't enough to close the case, and she knew it. "Claire," she said, pacing the room, "we need someone who can crack this wide open." Claire hesitated before responding. "There's someone who might be able to help, but you're not going to like it." Rachel froze, her curiosity piqued. "Who?" Claire handed her a file. The name on the cover read, "Julian Kane, a whistleblower and former business partner of Malcolm Royce." "Find him," Rachel said firmly. Elsewhere, Malcolm sat alone in his luxury penthouse, nursing a glass of scotch. The shadowy figure from the parking lot watched the building from a nearby alley. In their hand was a USB drive, the missing piece to the puzzle. The hidden account was only the beginning. The secrets buried beneath Malcolm Royce's empire were about to come crashing down. Rachel Dyer tapped her pen anxiously against her desk as she waited for the video call to connect. Julian Kane's face appeared on her screen, rugged and weathered, his piercing blue eyes sharp despite the faint signs of exhaustion. Once a rising star in the financial world, Julian had vanished from the public eye after a highly publicized fallout with Malcolm Royce. Ms. Dyer, Julian began, his tone wary. It's been a while since anyone's brought up Royce's name to me. What's this about? Rachel leaned forward. I need your help. Malcolm Royce is on trial for fraud, and I believe you hold the key to proving the full extent of his crimes. Julian chuckled bitterly. Malcolm Royce? That man destroyed everything I built. But I'm not sure what I can offer you now. I walked away from that life. Did you? Rachel asked, sliding a document across her desk as though he could see it. Because I have reason to believe you know about the offshore accounts, the ones tied to his missing $200 million. Julian froze, his gaze narrowing. What makes you think I'd know anything about that? Because you were his partner, Rachel said firmly. You helped build the framework for his empire. And if my hunch is correct, you left because you discovered he was siphoning funds without your knowledge. Julian leaned back, exhaling deeply. You're not wrong. I walked when I found out about the accounts, but you don't understand. Malcolm has a network of lawyers, enforcers, even politicians in his pocket. He doesn't just ruin people, he erases them. Rachel's voice softened. If we don't stop him, he'll keep destroying lives. He's already stolen the futures of countless families. Help me bring him down. Julian studied her face for a long moment, then sighed. There's a file, he said. Encrypted. It contains the details of the offshore accounts and every fraudulent transaction Malcolm orchestrated. I created it as insurance when I left, but it's buried deep in a secure server. Getting it won't be easy. Where is it? Rachel pressed. Julian hesitated. In an old data center, I used to operate under an alias, but the location is off the grid. Meanwhile, Malcolm Royce sat in his penthouse, staring at a message on his phone. The words chilled him. They know about Cayman. You need to act. He clenched his jaw, dialing a number. Shut it down, he barked. Whatever they think they've found, make it disappear. And keep an eye on Rachel Dyer. She's getting too close. The shadowy figure from the parking lot lingered nearby, watching the light in Malcolm's penthouse flicker. They gripped the USB drive in their pocket, their resolve hardening. The next day, Julian met Rachel at her office. He carried an unassuming briefcase and a cautious demeanor. If we're doing this, we need to move quickly, he said. Malcolm's people won't let this slide. As they prepared for their journey to the data center, Rachel's assistant, Claire, entered with a grim expression. You're being followed, she whispered, sliding a security camera photo across the desk. Rachel picked up the image. A man in a black hoodie lurked near her car, his face obscured. Julian tensed. That's one of Malcolm's people. We need to go now. The drive to the data center was tense. Julian explained the precautions he'd taken to secure the file, but Rachel couldn't shake the feeling they were being watched. When they arrived, the dilapidated building looked abandoned, its exterior overgrown with weeds. Is this it? Rachel asked, skepticism in her voice. Julian smirked. The best places to hide things are the ones no one wants to look at. Inside, Julian navigated a maze of old servers, finally stopping at one with a keypad. He began entering codes, but his hands shook slightly. If this file gets out, he said, Malcolm won't just lose his empire. He'll come after anyone who helped bring it down. Rachel placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Then we'll make sure he doesn't have the chance. The server hummed to life. But before Julian could extract the file, the sound of a car screeching to a halt outside echoed through the building. They've found us, Julian whispered, his voice tight with fear. Rachel pulled out her phone, dialing for backup. "We're not leaving without that file," she said firmly. The past was about to collide with the present, and the consequences could change everything. The dim light from the server cast eerie shadows across the room as Rachel and Julian froze. The screeching of tires outside was followed by the distinct sound of heavy boots crunching gravel. "They're here," Julian muttered, his voice tight with dread. Rachel steadied herself, her mind racing. "How long to extract the file?" she asked. Julian glanced at the progress bar on the screen. 3 minutes, maybe 4. Rachel nodded, her gaze darting to the entrance. "Do what you have to do. I'll buy us some time." Before Julian could protest, Rachel darted toward the door. She pulled it shut and locked it, her heart pounding. Outside, the sound of muffled voices grew louder. She spotted movement through a crack in the window, a group of men, dressed in dark clothes, approaching with purpose. One of them stepped forward, testing the locked door. "Open up," he barked, his voice sharp and commanding. Rachel pressed her back against the door. "Who are you?" she called out, buying precious seconds. The man didn't answer. Instead, he signaled to another, who retrieved a crowbar from the back of their vehicle. Inside, Julian's hands moved with a mix of speed and precision as he worked to decrypt the file. His breath was shallow, his focus absolute. "Come on," he whispered, urging the server to respond faster. The progress bar inched forward. 2 minutes. The door jolted as the men began prying it open. Rachel looked around for anything she could use to slow them down. Her eyes landed on a stack of old filing cabinets. She pushed them toward the door, her muscles straining, creating a makeshift barricade. "Julian," she shouted. "How much longer?" 1 minute, he called back, his voice tinged with panic. The door groaned as the crowbar forced it open a crack. A hand reached through, pulling at the lock. Rachel grabbed a nearby chair and swung it at the arm, drawing a sharp yelp from the intruder. "Stay out," she yelled, her voice firm despite her racing pulse. Back at the server, the file finally finished downloading. Julian transferred it onto a USB drive, his hands trembling as he pocketed it. "Got it," he shouted, grabbing his briefcase. Rachel turned just as the door burst open, the makeshift barricade toppling. 2 men lunged toward her, but she sidestepped, knocking one into a rusted shelf. She turned to Julian. "Run!" The two darted through the labyrinth of servers, the sound of their pursuers' footsteps close behind. Outside, the shadowy figure from the parking lot stood beside their vehicle, watching the chaos unfold. They spotted Rachel and Julian sprinting toward the exit and stepped forward, intercepting the men chasing them. "Hey!" the figure shouted, drawing the attackers' attention. The men hesitated, unsure of who this new player was. Before they could react, the figure hurled a rock at the windshield of their car, shattering it. "Leave now, or it gets worse." The men exchanged glances before retreating to assess the damage. Rachel and Julian stumbled out of the building, gasping for breath. The shadowy figure motioned to a nearby alley. "This way." Rachel hesitated. "Who are you?" "No time," the figure snapped. "Trust me, or they'll catch you." With no other option, Rachel and Julian followed. They darted through narrow alleys, emerging onto a deserted street. The figure stopped beside an old sedan, opening the door. "Get in," they said. Julian hesitated. "Why should we trust you?" The figure pulled out the USB drive they'd been carrying earlier. "Because I've been trying to take Royce down for years. And now we finally have the proof." Rachel's eyes widened. "You're the one who tipped us off about the offshore accounts." The figure nodded. And if you want to make it out of this alive, you'll get in the car. Now. As the sedan roared to life and sped away, Malcolm Royce sat in his penthouse, oblivious to the fact that the walls of his empire were closing in faster than he could imagine. The old sedan sped through the quiet streets, its engine humming steadily as Rachel sat in the passenger seat, clutching the USB drive Julian had extracted. In the back, Julian's fingers drummed nervously against his briefcase. "Who are you really?" Rachel demanded, her eyes fixed on the driver, the shadowy figure who had saved them. The driver, a man in his late 40s with a worn leather jacket and piercing gray eyes, glanced at her through the rearview mirror. "Call me Mark," he said simply. "I've been following Malcolm Royce's crimes for years. Let's just say I have my reasons for wanting him to fall." "That's not an answer," Julian interjected from the back seat. "How do we know you're not working for him?" Mark smirked. "If I were, do you think you'd still have that drive in your hands?" Julian fell silent, though his suspicious glare didn't waver. Mark turned onto a narrow alley, pulling into a dimly lit parking garage. He killed the engine and turned to face Rachel and Julian. "Listen carefully," he began. "Malcolm Royce isn't just a fraud. He's part of a larger network: bankers, politicians, even law enforcement. They've covered for him for years, and if you think this file alone will bring him down, you're wrong." Rachel crossed her arms. "Then what's your plan?" Mark leaned forward. "The USB drive is just a piece of the puzzle. It'll show the offshore accounts, sure. But Malcolm's real power lies in the names of the people he's bought off. I have those records. Combine them with what's on that drive, and we can destroy not just Malcolm, but the entire corrupt system protecting him." Rachel's brow furrowed. "If you have those records, why haven't you come forward?" Mark leaned back, his expression grim. "Because the last person who tried is buried 6 feet under. I needed the right people to help me finish this, and now here you are." Julian scoffed. "Convenient, isn't it?" Mark ignored him, pulling out a laptop from under his seat. "The question isn't whether you trust me. The question is, how badly do you want to take Malcolm Royce down?" Rachel hesitated. She didn't fully trust Mark, but she couldn't deny the logic in his words. "What do you need from us?" Mark opened the laptop, revealing an encrypted folder. "This contains the names, dates, and amounts of every bribe Malcolm ever paid. But it's locked behind a security protocol that requires a second key. The decryption code is buried in Royce's personal server." Julian groaned. "So, we're back to breaking into another server?" Mark nodded. "This time, it's in his private office. High security, no easy access. But with this," he held up a small device, "we can clone his server's hard drive remotely. We just need to get close enough to connect." Rachel exhaled sharply, the weight of the task pressing down on her. "You're talking about infiltrating his building. How do we pull that off without getting caught?" Mark grinned. "Leave that to me. You just need to be ready to act fast once we're in." As the trio hashed out the details of their risky plan, Malcolm Royce was already taking countermeasures. In his penthouse, his phone buzzed with a new text. "They have the file. But they'll need more. We're watching them." Malcolm's lips curled into a smile as he replied, "Let them come. They won't make it far." The stakes were rising. With the file in hand, but the final key still out of reach, Rachel, Julian, and Mark prepared for the most dangerous move. Yet a direct strike at the heart of Malcolm Royce's empire. The plan was bold, reckless even, but there was no turning back. The trio gathered in Mark's makeshift hideout, a dimly lit room cluttered with surveillance equipment and schematics of Malcolm Royce's corporate headquarters. Rachel studied the building's blueprints spread across the table. "This place is a fortress. Cameras on every floor, guards at every entrance. How do we even get inside?" Mark pointed to a loading dock on the schematics. "This is our way in. Every evening, deliveries come through here. We'll pose as couriers to slip past security." Julian frowned, pacing nervously. "And once we're inside, what then? These plans don't tell us where the server room is." "They don't need to.
Mark said, holding up the small cloning device. Once we're close enough, this will locate the server automatically. We just need to stay within range long enough to transfer the data. Rachel crossed her arms, her jaw set. And if Royce's people catch us? Mark's expression hardened. We can't let that happen. If we're caught, this whole thing ends here. That night, the three of them arrived at the loading dock, dressed in courier uniforms and armed with fake delivery manifests. Mark drove a van into the bay, his movements calm and precise. Rachel sat in the passenger seat, clutching a clipboard, while Julian fidgeted nervously in the back. As they pulled up to the checkpoint, a burly guard stepped out of the booth, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. "Evening," he said gruffly, inspecting their paperwork. "Late delivery for the executive offices," Rachel said smoothly, handing over the manifest. The guard scrutinized the papers, his eyes narrowing. For a moment, Rachel's pulse quickened, but then he grunted and waved them through. "You've got 20 minutes," he said. "Don't wander." Inside the building, Mark led the way, his movements quick but deliberate. He slipped the cloning device into his pocket, his eyes scanning for any signs of surveillance. The tension in the air was palpable. "Keep it together," Rachel whispered to Julian as they passed a group of security cameras. The device in Mark's pocket beeped softly, indicating they were close. He stopped in front of an unmarked door. "This is it," he said, gesturing for Rachel to keep watch. Inside, the room was dimly lit, filled with rows of humming servers. Mark pulled the device from his pocket and connected it to the nearest terminal. "It's working," he said, his voice low. 5 minutes tops." Rachel leaned against the door, her ears tuned to every sound. Julian stood nearby, wringing his hands. "Relax," Rachel said under her breath. "The last thing we need is for you to panic." Julian opened his mouth to respond, but the sound of approaching footsteps silenced him. Rachel's heart raced as two guards rounded the corner, their eyes narrowing as they spotted her. "Hey, you're not supposed to be here," one of them barked, reaching for his radio. Thinking quickly, Rachel stepped forward, a friendly smile plastered on her face. "Sorry about that. We're with IT, running some diagnostics on the servers. It's part of the routine upgrade." The guards exchanged skeptical looks. "At this hour?" "Last-minute request from upstairs," Rachel said, her tone confident. "You know how these execs are." The guards hesitated, but before they could press further, Mark's voice crackled through Rachel's earpiece. "Transfer complete. Time to move." Rachel exhaled in relief. "Thanks for your understanding," she said to the guards, turning to walk away. The trio regrouped at the loading dock, slipping back into the van just as the guards' suspicion began to grow. As they sped away from the building, Mark pulled the device from his pocket and handed it to Rachel. "This is it," he said. "Everything we need to bring Royce down." But Julian wasn't convinced. "Do you think he'll just let this happen?" "Royce knows we're coming for him." Mark's expression darkened. "Let him try to stop us." Back in his penthouse, Malcolm Royce watched the security footage from the server room, his lips curling into a cold smile. "So, they got what they wanted," he murmured. A man standing in the shadows behind him spoke. "Do you want us to take care of it?" Malcolm turned to face him, his smile widening. "No. Let them think they've won. It'll make their downfall that much sweeter." The trio thought they had outsmarted Royce, but they had no idea the game had only just begun. The stolen data felt like a victory as Mark, Rachel, and Julian reviewed the files at their hideout. The encrypted records from Malcolm Royce's private server were damning. Bribes to officials, offshore accounts, and financial transactions tying him to a shadow network of corruption. "We have everything," Rachel said, scrolling through the files. "This could bring down Royce and everyone who protected him." Julian leaned over her shoulder, his brow furrowed. "It's not enough to have this information. We need to make it public. The moment we leak it, Royce's empire crumbles." Mark's face darkened. "It's not that simple. Royce is watching us. He'll anticipate our next move. We can't afford A single misstep. Rachel glanced up. Then what do you suggest? Mark stood, pacing. We need to deliver this directly to the authorities, but not just any agency. Royce's influence runs deep. We need someone untouchable, someone he can't buy. Julian raised an eyebrow. And who exactly fits that description? Special Agent Karen Mitchell, Mark said. She's built her career on dismantling corruption cases like this. If we get this to her, Royce won't have anywhere to hide. Rachel nodded, but her instincts told her something wasn't right. And how do you know she's clean? Mark hesitated for a fraction of a second. I worked with her once. She's the real deal. Julian exchanged a glance with Rachel. Let's hope you're right, he muttered. The next morning, the trio set out to meet Agent Mitchell at a secure location arranged by Mark. They traveled in silence, the tension in the air thick enough to cut. Rachel clutched the USB drive tightly, her mind racing with worst-case scenarios. When they arrived at the abandoned warehouse on the city's outskirts, Rachel's unease deepened. The building was eerily quiet, the only sound the soft hum of the wind through broken windows. This doesn't feel right, Rachel whispered. Mark motioned for her to stay calm. Mitchell's people are careful. They'll show. But as they stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind them, the echo reverberating through the cavernous space. Drop the drive, a deep voice commanded. From the shadows emerged three armed men, their faces partially obscured. At their center stood Malcolm Royce himself, impeccably dressed and exuding cold menace. Mark's face went pale. This wasn't supposed to happen. Malcolm's smile was razor-sharp. Oh, but it did, Mark. Did you really think I wouldn't see this coming? I've been 3 steps ahead of you since the beginning. Rachel's grip on the USB tightened. You can't cover this up forever. The evidence is out there. Malcolm chuckled. You think that little drive scares me? I've built my empire by anticipating moves like yours. And now, I'll make an example of you. He gestured to his men. Take it from her. The armed men advanced, but Rachel wasn't about to give up. Run, she shouted, throwing the drive to Julian. Chaos erupted as Julian bolted toward a side exit. Mark lunged at one of the men, grappling for his weapon, while Rachel ducked behind a pillar, trying to evade capture. Julian's heart pounded as he sprinted through the maze of corridors. Behind him, footsteps thundered closer. He spotted a fire escape and scrambled up the rusted ladder, clutching the USB like his life depended on it. Back in the main room, Rachel and Mark fought desperately. Rachel used a piece of debris to fend off an attacker, while Mark wrestled another to the ground. You always underestimated me, Royce. Mark shouted, his voice strained. Malcolm's smile faltered slightly as he watched the chaos unfold. You've made a mess, Mark, but you won't leave here alive. On the rooftop, Julian reached the edge, the USB drive still secure in his pocket. One of Royce's men cornered him, gun drawn. Hand it over, the man demanded. Julian hesitated, then did the only thing he could think of. He tossed the USB drive over the edge of the building, watching it disappear into the darkness below. You idiot, the man roared, grabbing Julian by the collar. Down below, a figure waited in the shadows, catching the falling drive with precision. It was Claire, Rachel's assistant. She nodded to herself, tucking the USB into her jacket before slipping away unnoticed. Back inside, Rachel and Mark had managed to subdue the attackers, though both were battered and bruised. Julian, Rachel gasped, realizing he wasn't with them. Malcolm, still standing untouched, smirked. Your little plan just fell apart. You've lost. But Rachel stepped forward, bloodied but defiant. Not yet. As the trio regrouped and fled, Malcolm Royce stood in the wreckage, unaware that the USB drive was no longer in his grasp, and the real game had just begun. Claire slipped through the dark alley, the USB drive clenched tightly in her hand. She moved quickly but cautiously, her eyes scanning every shadow. The chaos at the warehouse had been a close call, but she'd anticipated that something would go wrong and prepared accordingly. When she reached her car, a nondescript sedan parked a few blocks away, she took a deep breath and started the engine. Her destination wasn't a safe house or a police station. It was a secure facility she'd arranged ahead of time, a place Malcolm Royce wouldn't think to look. Meanwhile, back at the hideout, Rachel, Mark, and a battered Julian regrouped. The atmosphere was heavy with frustration and exhaustion. "What were you thinking, Julian?" Rachel snapped, pacing the room. "Throwing the drive off the roof? We could have lost everything." Julian slumped into a chair, his face pale and his hands trembling. "They had a gun to my head, Rachel. I didn't have a choice." Mark, leaning against the wall with a grimace from a bruised rib, interjected. "Let's not turn on each other now. Royce thinks the drive is gone. That gives us an advantage." Rachel frowned, her arms crossed. "An advantage? We've lost the evidence and barely escaped with our lives." Mark shook his head. "Not necessarily." If Claire was where she was supposed to be, Rachel's eyes widened as realization dawned. "You told her to be there, didn't you?" Mark smirked faintly. "Let's just say I don't put all my faith in a single plan." An hour later, Claire's car pulled into a secure parking garage beneath an old office building. She stepped out and took the elevator to the 12th floor, where a small team of trusted contacts was waiting. "Do you have it?" One of them asked, a wiry man in a headset typing rapidly at a computer terminal. Claire handed him the drive. "It's all here. We need it decrypted and sent to Special Agent Karen Mitchell immediately." The man nodded, plugging the drive into his system. "Give me 10 minutes." At his penthouse, Malcolm Royce was savoring what he thought was a victory. He stood at the window, a glass of scotch in hand, as the city lights twinkled below. "They thought they could outmaneuver me," he mused aloud. One of his associates, the man who had cornered Julian, entered the room. "We've checked the area. No sign of the drive. It's gone." Malcolm's smile widened. "Good. By the time they realize what's happened, it'll be too late." But his satisfaction was short-lived. His phone buzzed, and he glanced at the screen. A message popped up from one of his inside contacts. "Urgent. FBI flagged encrypted files tied to you. A press leak is imminent." Malcolm's grip on his glass tightened. "What?" The associate stepped closer. "What's wrong?" Malcolm turned, his calm exterior cracking. "They didn't lose it. They played us. The drive is out there, and now the feds are involved." At the secure facility, Claire and her team finished decrypting the drive. The evidence was overwhelming: names, dates, transactions, and connections to Malcolm Royce's bribery network. Claire handed the final report to a courier who would deliver it directly to Agent Mitchell. "Make sure it gets to her," Claire said. "No detours, no delays." The courier nodded and disappeared into the night. Back at the hideout, Rachel's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and saw a message from Claire. "The drive is safe. The evidence is with Mitchell. He knows we're coming. Be ready." Rachel showed the message to Mark and Julian. "It's happening. We've got to move fast before Royce can retaliate." Mark nodded. "Royce will scramble his network, try to silence anyone connected to this. We need to get to Mitchell and ensure she has everything she needs to act." Julian hesitated. "And if Royce finds us first?" Rachel's voice was firm. "Then we fight back. This ends now." As the courier approached the FBI headquarters, Malcolm Royce's last play was already in motion. A black SUV tailed the courier, its passengers armed and ready. The final confrontation was imminent, and with the walls closing in, Malcolm Royce was prepared to do whatever it took to protect his empire, even if it meant crossing the ultimate line. The black SUV sped through the rain-slick streets, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Inside, Malcolm Royce's men tracked the courier's every move. The courier, unaware of the danger, gripped the steering wheel tightly as he approached FBI headquarters. From her hideout, Rachel monitored the situation on a live GPS feed sent by Claire. "They're tailing him," she said, her voice tense. Mark grabbed his jacket. "We can't let them intercept him. Let's move." The courier turned onto the final stretch leading to the FBI building. Behind him, the SUV accelerated. One of Royce's men rolled down the window, pulling out a pistol. "Take him out before he reaches the gate," the driver barked. As the SUV drew closer, a screech of tires echoed through the street. Another car swerved into the road, blocking the SUV's path. It was Rachel, with Mark and Julian beside her. "Hold on," Rachel shouted, slamming her foot on the gas and aiming the car directly at the SUV. The collision was jarring. The SUV swerved to avoid Rachel's car, slamming into a lamppost. The courier, now just feet from the FBI checkpoint, floored the accelerator and made it through the gates as armed agents emerged to secure the area. Inside the FBI headquarters, Special Agent Karen Mitchell stood at the ready. The courier rushed inside, handing over the USB drive. "Agent Mitchell," he said breathlessly, "this contains everything." Mitchell plugged the drive into a secure terminal. As the files loaded, her expression shifted from shock to determination. "Call the director," she ordered her assistant. "We're moving on Royce tonight." Back on the street, Rachel's car was wrecked, smoke curling from the hood. Mark stumbled out, wincing from the impact. "They're not down yet," he said, pointing at the men emerging from the SUV, weapons drawn. Rachel grabbed a tire iron from the trunk, her jaw set. "Then we hold them off until the feds get here." The standoff was brutal. Mark and Rachel fought with desperate resolve, using whatever they could find to fend off Royce's men. Julian, though terrified, managed to pull one of the injured attacker's radios and called for help. "This is Julian Kane," he said into the device. "We're under attack near FBI headquarters. Send backup." Inside his penthouse, Malcolm Royce watched the chaos unfold on a live feed from his security team. His smirk had vanished, replaced by a cold, calculated rage. "End this," he ordered his lead enforcer over the phone. "No loose ends." But as he spoke, his own phone began to vibrate. A new message flashed on the screen. "FBI agents en route. Surrender now, or we'll take you by force." Malcolm's hand trembled as he threw the phone across the room. For the first time, his carefully constructed empire was crumbling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. As Rachel and Mark fought off the last of Royce's men, the distant wail of sirens filled the air. Moments later, FBI agents flooded the scene, arresting the attackers and securing the area. Rachel collapsed against a wall, exhausted but relieved. "Did the courier make it?" she asked one of the agents. "He did," the agent confirmed. "Agent Mitchell has everything. Royce is done." At dawn, FBI agents stormed Malcolm Royce's penthouse. They found him standing by the window, a glass of scotch in hand. "You finally made it," Malcolm said, his voice dripping with bitterness. "Malcolm Royce, you are under arrest for fraud, bribery, and conspiracy," Agent Mitchell said as she stepped forward, her handcuffs gleaming in the morning light. Malcolm turned slowly, his smirk returning despite the circumstances. "It took you long enough." As they escorted him out in handcuffs, the city outside erupted in a media frenzy. Victims who had lost everything to Malcolm Royce now had the closure they had been waiting for. In the days that followed, the files on Royce's network were made public, leading to dozens of high-profile arrests and investigations. His name became synonymous with corruption, and his trial became a symbol of accountability. Rachel, Mark, Julian, and Claire watched the news coverage together, a quiet sense of victory settling over them. "It's over," Rachel said, her voice soft but resolute. Mark nodded. "For now, but there will always be another Royce out there." Rachel smiled faintly. "Then we'll be ready." As the credits rolled on Malcolm Royce's empire, a new chapter began for those who had fought to bring him down. Justice had prevailed, but the fight for truth and accountability would continue. As the story of Malcolm Royce comes to an end, it leaves us with a powerful reminder. Justice may be slow, but it always finds its way. The fight against corruption, greed, and deception takes courage, determination, and unity, and it's a fight worth continuing. If you enjoyed this thrilling tale of justice and resilience, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that keep you on the edge of your seat. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. We've got plenty more gripping tales coming your way. Thank you for watching, and remember, the fight for truth begins with you. Stay inspired, and we'll see you in the next story.